On the count of people on environmental council.
Those are those I sit on the panel.
And I'm John Marshall, Soil and Water.
Harrison Kremen, for County Planning and Zoning. Max Wheeler, Virginia Department of Environmental Quality and PFAS Program Coordinator.
John Reynolds, County Utilities.
Michelle Edwards, Rappahannock Regional Commission.
I'm Jessica Warloga, Delegate Full-Time Manager.
Brianna Hughes, I'm the Environmental Services Coordinator for the George Washington Regional Commission.
Chip Oils with George Washington Regional Commission.
And then do we have any visitors online?
John Gerlach from Fredericksburg City Council checking in here.
I had captured everybody,
Okay.
sorry
All
about
right.
that.
We have moved through the introductions, and then we're going to review and approve the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Number 2 on the agenda is the consent agenda. We have the River Basin Commission FY26 Work Plan Report, the year-to-date financial report, minutes from the previous meeting, and regarding adoption of policy for remote participation, required annual adoption. We have a motion to accept. We have a second. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Consent agenda passes unanimously. Next, we're going to move on to public comment. But before we get into that, kind of want to lay out a couple ground rules here. We have a very involved agenda here today, and so if we could keep comments short and sweet and to the point, that would be great, but I do not want to limit the time of the public. And so is anybody here for public comment in the room? Yes, sir?
As long as I may use it.
Yes, please.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Brent Hunting. I'm with Friends of the Rappahannock. I will be brief. I'd like to speak with you briefly on the regional water supply planning process that is underway. A little bit of an update. The regional water supply planning process was initiated in 2024. The process mandates a river basin approach. DEQ has created regional planning units that must submit a regional water supply plan to DEQ by 2029. In the Rappahannock River watershed, there are 5 RPUs. These are planning units. They include up and down the watershed. I won't go into all where they are, but we do have 5 different ones included in the watershed. The goals of each plan are identified. They have to ensure that adequate and safe drinking water is available to all citizens, encourage, promote, and protect all other beneficial uses of the Commonwealth's water resources, encourage, promote, and develop incentives for alternative water resources, and finally encourage the development of cross-jurisdictional water supply projects. The data compiled in the plans due to DEQ by 2029, along with all other data, will be used to conduct cumulative impact analysis, evaluating impacts of groundwater and surface water resources throughout Virginia from current and projected withdrawal demands. And then they will be published as a resource for all of us to use to guide into the future. So we are still in the early planning of this because information has just been sent to the localities who are participating within those regional planning units. And at this point, because we are early in the planning process, Friends of the Rappahannock would like to encourage as much coordination as possible of all members in the watershed to create these plans. And I will say we have been successfully working with all the RPUs to help get information, understand where they are in their process. So we thank everyone for that transparency. And so finally, by working together regionally, it is FOR's hope that by 2030, a single river basin-wide model using the data that will use the data from all 5 RPUs can be created that will guide responsible water supply decision-making and ensure all beneficial users have access to water resources in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else here for public comment? Do we have anybody online for public comment? All right, moving on. First up is we have a presentation on PFAS. Again, For the interest of time, this presentation is going to be online, so I ask that everybody,
Actually, the first one will be in person. It's
First one's-
two-part.
okay,
The second part's online.
okay. I ask that you hold questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll go around the room and see if there's any questions or comments. And that way we can get through the presentation, because sometimes those questions we have at the beginning are answered on the back end. So, sir, the floor is yours.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. Just gonna make sure the folks online can see this. It's just taking a minute to respond. I know, it's just,
Gotta love technology.
There you go.
there we go. Sorry, it just takes 1 moment.
Any minute.
There we go.
There we go. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. How is my volume? People in the room and people online.
I think you're good.
Excellent. So I am Dr. Max Wheeler. I'm the PFAS Program Coordinator at the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And today, along with my colleague Bailey Davis, who's joining us virtually, we're going to be talking to you about Virginia's PFAS activities. So the way this presentation is going to go is I'm going to start by giving a background on what PFAS are, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm then going to pass the mic proverbially to Bailey to talk about Virginia Department of Health's Office of Drinking Water's PFAS activities, and then take the microphone back to talk about what DEQ is working on specifically. So, sorry for the tech, because we're going to be going back and forth throughout the presentation. So, where I'm going to get started is with the question, what are PFAS? So, PFAS itself is an acronym. It stands for per polyfluoroalkyl substances. This is a family of chemicals with some 15,000 members identified by the EPA, with over 800 known uses in consumer as well as industrial products. The common thing all of these molecules have in common are chlorine bonds, usually a high density of chlorine bonds. And these bonds are very important because they make the molecule particularly inert. That means it's unreactive both chemically and physically, so it doesn't want to interact with any other molecules. And so this gives these materials very clear and important properties, namely that they make surfaces waterproof, oil-proof, stain-proof, or otherwise non-stain. And so you can imagine a wide variety of places where that may be useful, including some of the products on the screen. In addition, these molecules get used in what are called aqueous film forming foams, which are a type of firefighting foam used to put out fires where water alone would not be appropriate. Specifically things like oil, gasoline, and jet fuel. As a result of all of these uses, they get used pretty widespread in consumer products, and as a result, get released into the environment. And when they get released into the environment, the stability of that carbon-fluorine bond comes back to become a problem instead of a beneficial use. And that's that these molecules do not break down on human timescales. Estimates range between 500 and thousands of years that it will take for these molecules to break down back into inorganic components. And so we have these molecules that are widespread in use and don't break down in the environment. And if we go to the next slide, we see that are also impacting human health.
We are frozen.
So what you will see on this next slide when it comes up is a list of health effects that 2 molecules out of those 15,000 have. And those 2 molecules are PFOS and PFOA. Now, when we talk about PFAS in general, we typically use that name PFAS. But when we start getting into regulations, we don't regulate all 15,000 chemicals as a family. We regulate individual molecules. And so when we talk about those individual molecules, rather than trying to say their name, like perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, we're going to abbreviate that to PFOS. And then to keep things clear, when we're talking about the family, you'll hear PFAS. And when you hear about each of the individual molecules, you'll hear spelled out, so PFOS, PFOA, just to keep everything clear. Now, PFOS and PFOA are the 2 most well-studied of the PFAS molecules. And they have many known health effects, just a few of which are shown here on the screen. We see things like immune effects, like the body's reduced ability to fight infections, and even decreased vaccine response in children. We see developmental effects in children, and we even see some reproductive effects, decreasing fertility. But what makes makes these molecules even more concerning is that the EPA has recognized that these molecules are likely to cause cancer, specifically cancers like prostate, kidney, testicular cancers. And so as a result of the widespread use of these chemicals, their persistence in the environment, and their known health effects, calls to regulate these chemicals have been met with action at the state and federal level. So where we're going to turn our attention next is to give you a sense of the landscape of those regulations, starting at the federal level on the next slide. 2024 was a particularly big year in terms of PFAS regulation, with 3 different regulatory actions becoming finalized over the course of 2024. The first 2 of those actions happened in April of 2024, where PFOS and PFOA were designated as hazardous substances under CERCLA, which is also known as the super bubble. This requires some amount of cleanup, as well as some amount of funding mechanisms for that cleanup. In addition, the first ever national drinking water standards were set for 6 PFAS. In this regulatory action, maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, were set for 6 PFAS in drinking water. You can see those 6 chemicals on this upper of the 2 tables, as well as in your slide packets. PFOA and PFOS were regulated at 4 parts per trillion, and that is trillion with a T. For some context, a part per trillion is a very tiny number. It is the same as a single drop of water out of 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So a very large volume in comparison to a very small volume that it takes to contaminate water with these chemicals. In addition to PFOA and PFOS, 4 other PFAS were regulated: PFHXS, PFNA, and HFPODA, which is also known as Gen X, which were regulated at 10 parts per trillion. And a mixture of those 3 chemicals with 1 additional chemical known as PFES were regulated as a mixture. I will note that those 4 non-PFOS and PFOA chemicals have been proposed by the EPA to have their regulations rescinded and reconsidered, and Bailey will talk a little bit more about that when we get into his presentation. The last of these regulations to mention is the aquatic life criteria for PFAS, specifically PFOA and PFOS. This regulation was finalized in October, and currently DEQ is in the process of adopting these water quality criteria into our water quality standards. Currently in the regulatory process, it is going to the State Water and Control Board in November, and sometime in the spring, summer of next year, that regulation will be open for public comment again, if you're interested in following that process and commenting on that. That's where we are at the federal level. Turning our attention to the state level on the next slide. In each of the last, in 5 of the last 6 General Assembly sessions, the General Assembly has taken some action on PFAS, and you can see each of those actions here and in your notes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going too detailed into any of these, but I do want to highlight 2 of these pieces of legislation that are particularly important to our discussion here. First, in 2022, the General Assembly allocated funding for surface and groundwater monitoring at DEQ. This is a program that continues to this day and has expanded to fish tissue. We're going to show you some of that data statewide later in the DEQ portion of the presentation, as well as focusing in on the Rappahannock Basin, so you have a sense of what's going on here. And then the other piece of legislation to mention is the 2024 General Assembly action, which created a partnership between the Department of Health and the DEQ to address PFAS in drinking water. And that's why we're doing this joint presentation today, because there's a lot of overlap in our staff right now as we hop back and forth to address this particular issue. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Bailey once we get his slides up.
It's Max. I'll wait for the slide deck to come up. Apologies for not being able to be there in person today. I'm on the back end of a COVID bout. So, y'all hear me? Is my audio okay?
Bailey, would you prefer to advance your own slide deck?
Sure, I could just cue you.
So that you can share.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I'll just ask you to advance the slides if that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Is it possible to turn it up a little bit?
Okay, thank you. Apologize for not being able to be there in person, getting over a bout of COVID. So I'll be discussing the drinking water regulations in more depth as introduced by Max earlier, and activities that the Office of Drinking Water is taking to address PFAS in water systems in the state. Next slide, please. Before I start discussing the EPA's final PFAS regulation, I thought I'd provide some background on state actions that had occurred prior to the regulation being approved. As Max just presented, there was a 2020 House Bill number 586 that directed the Office of Drinking Water to establish a Virginia PFAS work group, conduct a PFAS occurrence study, and ultimately produce a recommendation on establishing statewide contaminant limits on PFAS in drinking water. And while that committee was working towards that goal, the EPA introduced a notice of intended regulatory action with regards to PFAS in drinking water, and Virginia decided to adopt that regulation once it was released, rather than trying to submit their own MCLs for PFAS at the time. There was concern that the limits that would be proposed for Virginia would not match up with the federal regulations, and so it was determined just to go with the federal regulations as produced. So that regulation was finalized in April of 2024, and as Max covered the regulatory limits that were included in that rule, as you can see here, it covers 5 individual compounds as well as a 6th that's included in the hazard index. Hazard index is a calculation that's based on the sum of concentrations of at least 2 of the PFAS compounds listed in this chart. You'll notice that PFBS does not have an individual MCL and is included in the hazard index calculation based on a health advisory level of 2,000 parts per trillion. Systems that identify PFAS compounds below the MCL but above the trigger level, which is shown on this slide, will be subject to more frequent compliance monitoring following the initial monitoring period. This regulation is applicable to over 1,800 public water systems in the state. And as a reminder, public water systems is defined as a system that serves 15 service connections or 25 people at least 60 days of the year. This regulation is applicable to community water systems, that's systems that serve the same community on a daily basis. So think of your large municipalities down to your small neighborhood communities, and also non-transient, non-community water systems, which serve the same population for a large part of the year, such as schools, hospitals, and office buildings. Next slide, please. Here you can see the implementation schedule that was established once the PFAS rule was finalized in April of 2024. By April of 2027, eligible systems that submit the results of initial monitoring for regulated PFAS compounds, and I'll expand the requirement in a minute, have to start routine compliance monitoring. They also have to share the results of their initial monitoring with the public, which can be done through their consumer confidence reports. And they also have to issue public notification if they fail to monitor or submit initial monitoring data, as well as any testing violations that occurred. Starting in 2029, systems will have to meet the MCLs, they'll have to comply with the MCL levels, meaning they'll have to treat their finished drinking water to below the MCL levels, or they'll be in violation of the rule. Any violation will also trigger additional public notification. Next slide, please. Here's the requirement for initial monitoring for systems. Systems have different requirements based on the population served and the source of their drinking water. Systems with surface water sources, as well as groundwater systems that serve greater than 10,000 persons, are required to test their finished drinking water 4 times in a calendar year, with samples collected 2 to 4 months apart. This is intended to test seasonal variability as well as having multiple data points to evaluate. Groundwater systems serving less than 10,000 customers have to take 2 samples over a 12-month period, collected 5 to 7 months apart. This testing can be costly, and this reduced schedule recognizes the higher stability of groundwater sources as well as the smaller reach of these groundwater systems that serve a less population. Next slide, please. After the final rule was released and incorporated, the EPA was sued by multiple groups who argued the way it was released did not follow protocol and also proper health-based standards. The lawsuit went through a series of advances while the new federal administration asked for time to review the rule. And in May of this year, the EPA announced they intended to make changes in the rule that was passed. These changes included precision of all PFAS compounds with the exception of PFOA and PFOS, which they intend to remain unchanged. That's important when we start looking at the statewide data, how that will impact Virginia specifically, or maybe not. 2, they intend to extend the compliance deadline from 2029 to 2031 to allow systems more time to evaluate and implement treatment technologies. And they also intend to establish a federal encryption framework, as well as launching initiatives to help smaller systems comply while increasing polluter accountability measures. The EPA announced that intention. The court cases are still proceeding. The most recent information was that in August, a U.S. Court of Appeals set a deadline for the EPA to file a motion on whether they intended to defend the rule in court or not. The motion was filed to partially vacate the rule and rescind the MCLs as they're stated in their announced changes. In this motion, the EPA admitted error of announcing a regulatory determination and final rule simultaneously for the non-PFOA and PFOS compounds, therefore denying the public a chance to comment on each step separately. So that is the mechanism with which the EPA intends to use for rescission of those compounds we discussed earlier. Next slide. So now I want to get into a little bit of the data that's been collected and cover why the rule change federally, those impact of the rule changes might be negligible a bit for Virginia. This map shows the existing current state of testing as we are aware of it, albeit with a little bit of lag in the posting of our data. We do not have initial monitoring data as yet for systems, so the data is coming from testing initiatives undertaken by ODW, as well as UCMR data collected, which we'll talk about shortly, and some self-reported data from Waterworks. The blue shaded figures on this map represent systems that do not have any detections above the MCLs, and the red systems are ones that do have at least one compound detected above the contaminant levels. As you see, the detections cluster around some of the more heavily populated areas, and Max will be presenting more on this shortly, as well on the areas we're discussing. Next slide, please. This slide shows a summary of testing initiatives that ODW has undertaken, encompassing about 476 waterworks. Some of these systems have been tested multiple times, which is why when you may see some of the numbers not adding up in the totals column, like you would expect. But what this data does tell us is that the large majority of PFAS contamination being identified includes PFOA and PFOS. So far, there have only been 2 systems in Virginia that we have identified that have tested have an exceedance of PFAS compounds that do not also include an exceedance of either PFOA or PFOS. Since treatment for all of these compounds is the same, either using granulated activated carbon or ion exchange resins, the change in federal guidance will have very little impact to the customers as they will be getting treatment of impaired water sources. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, otherwise known as UCMR, and specifically the round 5 of UCMR, UCMR 5, which started in January of 2023 and runs through December of 2025. This round of UCMR testing encompasses 3,300 plus waterworks of a national representative sample of systems less than 3,300 waterworks across the nation. They must monitor for 29 different PFAS compounds plus lithium. Sampling follows the initial monitoring requirements depending on size and source water. So if a system is doing UCMR testing and they're a source water system, they're doing 4 samples over a year period. Groundwater systems less than 10,000 will be doing the 2 samples over a year period for this UCMR testing. And this data can be used to satisfy a waterworks initial monitoring requirements if they so choose to do so. Next slide, please. So on the most recent release of EPA data for UCMR data for national waterworks, EPA has announced that they are 83% complete with UCMR testing in this round of testing. And they have had enough data to start making some determinations about occurrence across the nation with different sized water systems. So what you'll see on this first slide is the number of water systems that have a full set of UCMR data submitted. That's either 4 for the surface water and groundwater over 10,000 or 2 for the groundwater under 10,000. So there's about 3,400 plus large water systems, 3,400 plus medium water systems, and about 500 small water systems. Next slide. Of these water systems, you see on this chart the number of occurrences of different compounds and the exceedances that have occurred. So 410 large water systems out of the 3,440 that have presented a full data set have PFOS exceedance. 216 in the medium and 34 the small. And on the right-hand side, you'll see what that means as far as percentages of waterworks that have an exceedance. You'll notice that the regulated compounds that are intended to be rescinded have a much lower occurrence data than PFOS, PFOA compounds, with only 1 Gen X in a large system, 1 Gen X exceedance in a medium system across the nation. Hazard index accounts for about 1.2% of water systems that have an exceedance, but the large driver of exceedances of this rule set are from the PFOS, PFOA compounds. Next slide, please. So this is a summation of all of the systems. So the EPA took the occurrence data that they've seen, and they've done a weighted estimate of the total amount of systems they anticipate to exceed the federal PFAS rule once initial monitoring data is submitted. And what they came up with was on a national average, weighted percentage-wise, about 8.5% of systems will exceed the regulatory limits. This is lower than their anticipated 10 to 12% when they initiated the rule, and it is in line with what we're seeing from the data from Virginia. Although Virginia data at this rate currently stands a little bit under 13%, but that is skewed a little bit by some of the targeted testing initiatives that ODW has undertaken as we've been trying to identify potential source contaminations and targeting systems close by landfills and other airports and of known PFAS contamination. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the cost of complying with these PFAS rules for public water systems. So ODW was compelled to do a cost study last year. There was a bill of the General Assembly that required ODW to undertake a study to the cost of implementation for Virginia Waterworks. And the estimates that you're seeing on the screen are what resulted from that study. Capital cost estimate of 643 to 904 million. That's to treat the contaminated water sources that were identified. Annual operation expenditures between 72 and 88 million, and ongoing annual monitoring estimate of about $700,000. Now, these numbers were skewed pretty heavily by some large numbers that we did receive from Fairfax Water for potential cleanup of an issue in the Occoquan region reservoir. And so those were split out into our General Assembly report to identify the large influence that they had on the total numbers. Next slide, please. As far as the study findings are concerned, it goes without reason, but larger waterworks are better positioned to afford the needed CapEx and OpEx using rate increases over large customer bases. Smaller waterworks have more difficulty in affording needed CapEx and OpEx because of the smaller rate bases. And to deliver the needed treatments, waterworks are expected to utilize funding models composed of loans, federal grants when available, bonds obtained through the Virginia Resources Authority, rate increases, and finally funds from litigation claims, which are ongoing now. Next slide, please. Overview of last year's PFAS project summaries in project funding summary in Virginia. So you see that every year the amount of resources applied for federal funding has been increasing, with 2024 having 33 million in project funds requested, and the amount of funding that's been received thus far from the Office of Drinking Water. So there is a gap in the amount requested and the amount that was available. We do have project funding available for waterworks that are in need, and we are evaluating proposals annually to fund those projects, but there is going to be an increased need as the compliance deadline nears. Slide. I think that's all I have. So I'm going to send it back over to Matt.
Sorry, just give me a second.
But in the meantime, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what Virginia DEQ has been focusing on PFAS-wise over the last year. Much of our effort over the last year has been working on implementing House Bill 1085 and Senate Bill 243. This is a pair of bills that was passed by the 2024 legislation that created a partnership between Virginia DEQ and the Office of Drinking Water. Specifically, the Department of Health is directed to send any notices of exceedances of those PFAS and NCLs to the Department of Environmental Quality, and then DEQ is supposed to use those to conduct source assessments to identify significant sources in the source waters of those drinking water systems. Essentially asking us to identify significant sources, propose regulatory and non-regulatory options for addressing those high significant sources of PFAS. In order to conduct these source assessments, DEQ is given two authorities. The first is to require facilities that may be significant sources to self-report their use or manufacture of PFAS. That is, going to those facilities and asking them, do you use PFAS or do you manufacture PFAS? If so, which PFAS and in what amount? And then we can also ask the facilities to monitor their discharge quarterly for PFAS up to 1 year. That is, seeing what PFAS is coming out of their effluent into the streams of Virginia to again identify not just what facilities are intentionally using PFAS, but also which facilities are discharging PFAS. In addition to these two authorities, DEQ was given two directives. The first was to form an expert advisory committee to advise both DEQ and the Department of Health on PFAS-related issues, specifically targeted at source assessments. This committee has met 4 times since July of 2024, the most recent of which was on August 18th of this year. The minutes of these meetings are available on Virginia's regulatory town hall. If you'd like to get a sense of what we have been discussing. The next of these meetings is scheduled for sometime next spring after the General Assembly session. In addition to forming that expert advisory committee, DEQ is required to write annual reports due to the General Assembly on October 1st of every year. That report is just a week away. It's currently in the finalization stages and should be available on October 1st to the General Assembly. And I don't know what machinations need to happen before it's getting released to the public. It should be available shortly thereafter, if not on October 1st. In addition to these two directives, DEQ was also directed to use the 2 new authorities, specifically for drinking water systems that we were notified of having exceedance on or before September 1st, 2024. DEQ sent notifications on November 24th and 25th, just ahead of Thanksgiving 2024, sending out 185 letters to facilities asking them to self-report and or monitor for PFAS. We're currently in the process of getting some of that data back in. All of the self-reporting data is in, and I will be showing you some of that data in just 2 slides. But the monitoring data, they were not expected to start sampling until April, and results are still coming in, and we're working through some data management challenges. And so I don't have any of that data to show you here today, but if you're interested in seeing some of the very preliminary results, the August 18th Expert Advisory Committee meeting does have some of that basic analysis of that effluent monitoring. But before I show you the self-reporting data, let's highlight the facilities, the drinking water systems across the state that have PFAS exceedances on the next slide. In total, DEQ has received 5 data transfers from the Department of Health. And in total, there are 59 drinking water systems across the state that have PFAS exceedance. The pink dots that you can see on the screen are groundwater systems with exceedances, and the blue squares are surface water systems with exceedances. By number of systems, the groundwater are more impacted, but in terms of the number of people impacted, it's really the surface water driving those numbers. You can see on this map a pink blob. That is the Rappahannock River Basin. And you can see that there are some exceedances within the basin. Specifically, there are 12 drinking water systems with exceedances in the basin, clustered in Culpeper and Fauquier counties. About 5,600 people are impacted, with about 75% of that coming from just one system in Fauquier County. Moving on to the next slide, we have some examples of PFAS use in Virginia. So we surveyed 109 facilities asking them, do they use or manufacture PFAS? All of those facilities responded to our survey. 0 of those facilities indicated any PFAS manufacture in Virginia, and 75% indicated no PFAS use in Virginia. Of those that did indicate PFAS use, you can see some examples of the PFAS that are in use. I've separated the PFAS into 3 categories: polymeric, non-polymeric, and aqueous film forming foams. The polymeric PFAS are things like Teflon that are kind of more in the solid form. The non-polymeric PFAS are the PFAS that we've really been talking about so far: the PFOS, the PFOA, the GenX, HFPODA, all of those type of chemicals fall into that category. And then aqueous film forming foam is a subcategory of that non-polymeric PFAS, but manufacturers usually don't tell us what PFAS are there, so I'm going to put them in a separate category just so you can see that aqueous film forming foams are used in Virginia. One thing I will note, as you look over the slide, is you'll see things like WD-40 plumbing tape. Only a small handful of facilities responded that they use those 2 products. I expect many more do use WD-40, just if my own father's work in the shop is any indication. And so so this question is specifically regarding intentionally used PFAS as part of a manufacturing process. And so I'd say WD-40 and plumbing tape are mostly there because we had a few facilities that were particularly dedicated to tracking down all the PFAS in their facilities. Then we will move on to the next slide. The one other piece of legislation that I do want to highlight for you is House Bill 2050. This was passed by the 2025 General Assembly. It targets PFAS in the Occoquan Reservoir, which is just one watershed up, so I wanted to make sure that you are aware of what's going on in your neighborhood. Here, in the House Bill 2050, this program creates the Occoquan PFAS reduction program. It targets certain discharges in the Occoquan Reservoir, specifically 12 discharges that you can see on this map. In this particular program, facilities are asked to sample quarterly for PFAS in their effluent indefinitely. And if PFAS is measured in excess of those drinking water MCLs, by permanent condition, they need to reduce the PFAS to below those MCLs. This bill just went into effect in July, and the first data collection needs to happen by October 1st, and then they have 45 days to respond with that data to DEQ. So it's still very early days, but this is one of the other PFAS pieces of legislation going on that I wanted to highlight for this group. Stepping outside of our effluent monitoring, DEQ has been doing ambient monitoring. You can see a statewide map on the next slide. So what we've been doing since 2021 is monitoring the state's water columns, and since 2023, monitoring fish tissues across the state. You can see that we have good spatial coverage of the state in terms of our water column data, which are the green circles. And our fish tissue have hit most of the major river basins, but there are a couple that are still missing. We work on a 3-year rotation. We're currently in year 3 of that rotation, so those basins should be filled in early next year as that data comes in from the department, from DCLS, the Division of Consolidated Laboratory Services. On the next slide, we zoom in to the Rappahannock River Basin, where we have taken some water column samples. In total, we've taken just shy of 50 samples throughout the basin. Of those, 23 had PFAS detected. You can see up in the headwaters, you don't see too much in the way of PFAS, but as you move down, we do see more and more of that PFAS indicated by those orange hexagons. On the next slide, we have some fish tissue data. Again, we've taken about 40 fish tissue samples from across the basin, some showing PFAS detected, some showing PFAS not detected. The highest detection, if you advance this slide, is a dot. Okay, maybe we went to PowerPoints. Back one slide, sorry. The highest detection in the Rappahannock Basin is this point for those in the room. If you can put a mouse over that, that'd be very helpful. Where PFAS was measured at 1,000 parts per trillion. Now, that number is much higher than the drinking water standards. But to contextualize that, the Office of Toxicology in the Department of Health in May finalized fish consumption guidelines for PFAS. They set a limit at 20,000 parts per trillion, saying no fish should be consumed, and a limit at 10,000 parts per trillion, saying only 1 to 2 meals per week or per month should be consumed. And here, we're at 1,000 parts per trillion, 10 times below that particular limit. So PFAS has been detected in the basin, but it's at concentrations below the fish consumption advisories set by the department, 10 times below that. If we move to the next slide, the last thing that I would like to share with you all before we move to questions are some future considerations. Every year, the Environmental Council of the States, or ECOS, surveys all the states across the country on their PFAS actions, their PFAS priorities, and their needs for the following year. You can see on this particular slide a word cloud showing the state's priorities for 2025. As you take in that word cloud, you should notice that many of those priorities are reflected in what DEQ and the Department of Health has been doing. But there are some items on that particular list that we have not prioritized yet. The thing to understand about PFAS is that the regulatory environment around it is growing quickly and rapidly evolving. DEQ follows sound regulatory science implements the directives of the General Assembly and the EPA. And as the General Assembly and the EPA take action, the EQ is prepared to implement those directives. The other thing to mention outside of the priorities are the three needs that were identified from the federal government. Those three needs are guidance on destruction and disposal, emphasis on source control, and increased funding. Guidance on destruction and disposal is one of the current open questions with PFAS. It's not quite clear what we should do with PFAS after we remove it from the environment. Currently, if you Google PFAS and keep tabs on it the way I do, you see about once a month there's some new researcher who's identified a way to break down PFAS in the lab. And then about a month or 2 months later, there's a startup that's trying to commercialize that technology. And so it's a place that is rapidly evolving, but we need to have regular updates on what those disposal and destruction guidelines should be. And since ECOS put out this survey, the EPA has pledged to update their guidance annually instead of every 3 years. In addition to guidance and disposal, the states would like to see an emphasis on source control. This is something that DEQ is focused on. That's what House Bill 1085 and Senate Bill 243 are focused on. But we still need more help from the federal government. Currently, there's a lot of word of mouth going around on PFAS sources. So if you sit in the right webinar or go to the right lecture, you may hear before or after some new source category that may be of concern. And moving those away from word of mouth into some kind of guidance would be very helpful for us at DEQ. And then the last identified need is increased funding. As Bailey showed in his cost estimates, cleaning up PFAS is not going to be free, and money is going to be needed from the state and federal government to implement these directives. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time. And Bailey and I are both here, ready to answer any questions that you have. Thank you all.
All right, thank you very much. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go around the table. Mr. Marshall, do you have any questions? Mr. Lee, any questions?
Yes, sir. So many questions. Well, so we're in worse shape now than we were several years ago with regards to PFAS, or we're in better shape? In terms of the contamination level, that was a lot of information to take in. I'm just trying to digest everything. And did you say that the EPA, that the federal EPA had rescinded some of their controls on PFAS, and kind of where are we in general with everything?
I would say we are more aware of the issues at this point versus better or worse. We're currently working to make things better, but it's still very early stages. The EPA has said that they plan to rescind 4 of those drinking water MCLs. But as Bailey showed, that it's going to have very little impact on Virginia. Only 2 drinking water systems across the state had incidences of just one of those 4 MCLs, but not also having incidences of PFOA or PFOS, which is going to be maintained.
Okay. And then you mentioned that cleaning the PFAS, the water from PFAS is expensive. So what's the process for doing that when we detect that there's too much PFAS in the water system? So how do we clean that?
Bailey, would you like to take that question?
Sure. There's a couple different technologies that are utilized. Mostly, the most prominent one is using granulated activated carbon, or GAC, to capture the PFAS compounds. PFAS compounds have a high affinity for that material, so that requires water systems to create a filter bed, basically, of this material. The issue is that material will be spent after a while of filtering water through it, and then you have PFAS contaminated GAC that you have to then dispose of. So that's where Max was getting into our disposal issues. What to do with the compounds once they've been captured onto this material. Ion exchange resins are also used, and that's more applicable to smaller systems that would use an inline filter process for that. There are some other treatment technologies that are available. Most of them won't accompany a large-scale water system, so a lot of it has to do with the volume that needs to be treated going through the system.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right, Mr. Nickel?
A quick question around, we have a public hearing coming up in Orange County regarding PFAS in biosolids that are spread on farmland, and I don't believe there's any regulation, or is there a regulation prohibiting PFAS in those biosolids?
Virginia does not currently have any regulations around PFAS types.
So when we go to this public hearing, I'm trying to figure, and I think it's DEQ's running it. And there's a biosolid company who is looking to renew their permit, yet we don't have any measure to understand whether or not PFAS will be in those biosolids. And if it is, then that could run off into the Rappahannock River, which could run into our water intake, which will go into our plant. We don't have granulated activated carbon in our system. So what do we do?
I'm going to throw this question to Brian Thomas, who's one of my supervisors.
I'll jump up here with the next. Folks on. Good afternoon. I work with Max. My name is Brian Thomas. Very good question. And we've received a number of questions about PFAS and biosolids and concerns. Max mentioned at the state level we don't have specific thresholds or criteria, and nor at the federal level for like nationwide consistent recommended endpoints or thresholds. Right? So one of the things that when Max is talking about is both the science is evolving and the regulatory climate associated with that is evolving. They're both kind of evolving very quickly. But at this point, unless and until either we have guidance at the federal level or at the state level, we don't have those thresholds in the The one thing I would note for consideration is, so land application biosolids has been in practice for decades, right? So it's not new, and there's not necessarily a renewal or expansion. There could be expanded land areas for application on farms or sites, but like the amount of biosolids may not be increasing necessarily. Instead, the options of where it can be applied. But if you looked at the data we have so far that Max shared in the Rappahannock Basin, we haven't seen numbers of particular alarming concerns. Fish are very good indicators, right? They're integrated at their lifetime, their exposure, where they are. And so we haven't seen exceedance or levels in fish that would trigger consumption highs and restrictions. So that's not a direct aspect of what do we do about biosolids and PFAS and biosolids, but it is an indicator of are we seeing it in the environment in the runoff, particularly in fish, which would be, in addition to drinking water, through drinking water exposure, through ingestion, fish and fish consumption is another pathway that can possibly help impacts. And right now, we're just not seeing it. So I just say take that into consideration.
May I ask a follow-up? So, thank you. Appreciate that. So, we have a public hearing on this permit renewal. We have no regulation. We know that PFAS are a new thing. The science is undetermined. We're still trying to figure out some of that, but we know it doesn't break down for gazillions of years or whatever that's going to be. We won't be here to know that, but we will be here to suffer the consequences if we don't do something about it. So when we go to a public hearing and someone's trying to get a permit, I think the only way we can, if there's no regulation, what can we do? Renew the permit, there's no controls. Is DEQ able to say, you need to test your biosolids for PFAS, and if it exists, then you shouldn't put it down? Is that a condition that could be put on the permit?
One of the things that we don't know is what is that level of PFAS concentrations in biosolids that would trigger us to say, limit application, don't apply it, right? So that's one thing we just don't know that anymore. There are some states, there's not many if you look nationally, but some states do have requirements for monitoring for biosolids. And some of those states have set action levels and thresholds. Our nearest neighbor in Maryland has some monitoring requirements and has some threshold levels and recommendations on the application for humidity application. I'm not aware that those thresholds are based on science and exposures that would be giving out on as much as the distribution of data and where we see the highest sources and lowest sources. So the idea of establishing thresholds to limit or eliminate application, I don't think we're there yet. We don't have a lot of information and data, and that's probably in the progression of how it may play out with PFAS and biosolids. The progression would be at some point gathering information. I would mention that at the federal level, there is a recent risk assessment, is that the right terminology, that was published in a public comment period closed recently, where it was looking at particularly farm families and families in direct proximity to land where biosolids have been applied, and looking to see really, is there a right? Should we go further into looking into this at the federal level? I think the answer is yes, there's an issue, but also some of the assumptions and background in the science are there. I don't think they've finalized the risk assessment. I'm looking for at Max, because he stays plugged in on these, but that information's out there, and the comment period closed in August, I believe, for that study. So again, it's in an awkward position of having concern, being aware of concerns, but not really knowing the thresholds and basis to taking action.
Well, thanks. I'm not encouraged, but I appreciate where you are in the process. When you lead with the health effects and you read those, and then you say, well, we just got to wait and see how much it is and what gets into the drinking water, that seems to me to be a little too late. So my view is, if we know that there are PFAS in biosolids, and it's going into either surface water or groundwater, we ought to do something about it, because we know the harmful effects. So thank you for that.
And please provide your comments during that comment.
Oh, I will be there. Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Young.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Dr. Wheeler, for this presentation. So Stafford has been involved to ensure that our public was aware, and I think when I was chair 2023, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, back there, we started this. So we are working with VDH. We also was working with the state and with federal regulations. But my concern, and I noted this question earlier, is that on page, I thought it was page 7, but I mean page 4, but it's page 7 on yours. Given that self-reporting of PFAS contamination relies heavily on industry compliance, how do we address the inherent limitations of this system, particularly when there is evidence that self-reports are sometimes incomplete or inaccurate? And with the federal government moving in a direction of loosening some regulations with the EPA, and moving away from stringent PFAS regulations, how can we ensure that local water basins and states aren't left without sufficient oversight to protect the public health? Sorry.
Yeah, there's 3 or 4 questions in there.
Yeah.
I think I've got the first one with an answer, and we may...
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. I got this.
So on the self-reporting side of things, the legislation allowed us to ask, do you use or manufacture PFAS? And it operates on a good faith assumption from the facilities that they are going to go through their process and provide a complete understanding. One of the challenges that we have is that a lot of products don't necessarily list that they have PFAS intentionally added. Currently, that's something where it may be present, but there's no listing on an MSDS or anything from the manufacturer saying it's there. And so there's some oversight needed there, but that's well above what the EQ is capable of doing. And then if facilities are leaving that out, we have to work under a good faith assumption that they are going through the process and giving us the best available information.
And the second part was the EPA regulations, the fact that those are going to be loosened up because of the federal government. What you said, I don't expect you to have that answer, but what can we do for that system?
Bailey would like to have better.
But it's staying engaged with these issues and
Max, can I ask you a question? Many of the facilities that we've asked to start the report also conduct monitoring testing.
yes. So
Okay.
facilities that are self-reporting are also in general
Yeah.
also testing. So we're getting both ends.
And I'm not trying to, Brian has, been with Stafford for a while and we have a lot of information. So if any county has questions, feel free to ask Stafford what we've done because we're still in the process of doing what we have to do. We can piggyback and help out if anybody needs some information. Thank you.
Mr. Willis?
Yes.
I heard loud and clear that Fauquier is kind of at the epicenter of things here. And if I heard correctly, 75% of the people impacted by bad or deficient systems live in one of those, in a Fauquier well system or water system.
In the Rappahannock Basin.
75% of those impacted in the basin.
Yes.
That's a lot. Do you have any sense as to when either federal or state funding might be available to assist? I think when we've talked about doing some of the filtration systems for the New Baltimore system, numbers in the range of $40 million have popped up. And obviously, that would be a huge hit for the county government. And we'd like to act as quickly as possible. We also don't want to go out there and do something on our own if we're going to end up being able to have a significant funding partner down the road. So do you have any insight on that? And if you were in our shoes, what would you do?
DEQ does not regulate any of the drinking water systems. We do not have funding for drinking water systems, but the Department of Health does. So I think that's a question for Bailey. You have a much better insight there than I do.
Yes, I would say to reach out to our funding department. Anthony Hess leads our financial or construction assistance program that doles out federal funding for financial or for treatment technologies for PFAS, and he can guide you into the application process to that. There is federal funds that are available. When they did release the federal regulations in 2024, they included some federal funding for construction programs.
Do you have any idea, is there like a standard match requirement, or does it depend on the specific program?
It depends on the way that the construction project scores on their matrix and whether they require that or not. It depends on the source of the funds as well. So larger systems would be more of a loan program funded structure. Smaller systems would be eligible for principal forgiveness and things of those nature. So it depends on the size of the system and the construction project that's applied for.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you. Delegate Milday? Mr. Bellows?
Just briefly, since the primary focus of this commission is the Rappahannock River waters themselves, and you do say you monitor these chemicals in fish, so it appears that they biomagnificate throughout the environment. So if we eat fish, we're exposed to more of those chemicals than if we were drinking water. Why is the regulation on eating food so much lower than it is, or so much higher than it is in drinking water? And how does that get?
So the people who are setting those particular standards are outside of DEQ. I don't want to go too in depth because it's starting to get out of my particular knowledge area and focus. But broadly speaking, it's based off of assumptions of how much you're eating. And the idea, at least behind the fish consumption guidance, is that you're not eating fish for every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, where you're drinking water throughout the day. And so you're going to have less uptake as a result because you're not being exposed to fish tissues the same way you are in water. So you're going to have different limits set based off of that.
And to piggyback on that real quick, is there any other monitoring in other food sources? Do these chemicals go into plants as well, like vegetables and things like that, that do same what could be potentially in biosolids that are put on farmland does that particularly lead them to squash or watermelons or other fruits?
That is currently the forefront of scientific research. So right now, what many of the researchers who are focusing on PFAS in the environment are looking at are how is it working through the food system? Is it getting into plants? I have seen some studies that say some PFAS go more to the roots, some more go to the shoots. I don't have a good sense of what that is, but that's kind of the current forefront of scientific research.
It seems like from a standpoint of the commission, we would focus like on what potential sources are going into the Rappahannock River and how we can mitigate those and what policies we can submit to help mitigate those or help fund.
I'm eager to find out, to listen to the next presentation.
That's all I have.
Delegate Full. Ms. Donahan?
Yes, thank you. I used to own a restaurant, so I know water was tested quarterly. I'm wondering if that is a part of this process as well. And I know we have lots of breweries and lots of wineries that use a lot of water in our area. So are these industries being tested alongside of others?
Bailey, did you hear that question?
I did not hear the question. Sorry.
She's asking about testing restaurants, wineries, and breweries' water for PFAS.
Well, if the brewery or winery uses on-site treatment for a water system and serves a population that will classify them as a public water system, they would be testing their water as a public water system, even if it's used for the production of wine or beer, or if they have sufficient amount of visitors into their site, say a tasting room or something related to that. They are regulated in that capacity or tested in that capacity. Food testing in general would fall under a different
We lost you, Bailey.
Bailey, you are cutting in and out a little bit.
Apologies. Don't know how much that you heard. Essentially, if they're a water system, they would be tested for this source water.
Thank you.
Ms. Bender?
Yeah, my quick question is landfills and leachate from the landfills, is that also going to be required for testing?
Right now, we are focusing testing on areas where we have that drinking water impacted. And so if a landfill is regulated under our 50s program or as a significant industrial user as part of a pretreatment program, their leachate would be safe.
Right, thank you.
Ms. Holmes?
I have two quick questions. One, does DEQ have the authority, and I think this kind of piggybacks on what Mr. Bellows was saying, but do they have the authority to enact a drinking water maximum contaminant limit for PFAS? Like, I guess, like, again, like, why are, we're focusing on fish that we eat, but do they have the authority to?
Drinking water is regulated by the Department of Health, not DEQ in Virginia. And they are working on adopting the EPA's CLs for drinking water.
Okay, and then my second question goes back to one of the first slides where you talked about that PFAS has the cancer effects for prostate, kidney, and testicular cancer. And I'm wondering why it would have it for that. You might not be able to answer that, but not like ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, breast cancer. Like why, like the functions of some of those organs,
We know what that function is.
Well, I'm just saying, like, why, have they not tested for that, or is it just not, they haven't found any kind of link?
A lot of those cancer links come from places with very high PFAS exposures, and they're seeing clusters of those particular types of cancers there. Beyond that, that is,
okay.
I'm an environmental chemist, not a toxicologist.
I know, it
so
probably wasn't a fair
very
question, but it
distracted
was something that popped in my, okay, thank you.
There's some hypotheses and some research out there, but I don't have the answer to that particular question.
Ms. Long?
No questions.
All right,
I just have a follow-up question.
we're going to move on. We're going to move on to online. We have to keep going. So,
I just wanted to talk about the rivers.
Dr. Young, we're going to move on to the online members. We're going to move on to the online members. Does any online member of the commission have any questions?
It looks like Gerald Phillips has a question.
That's Vince.
Yeah, so
She's not a member.
we're only looking for members.
Sorry, my apologies.
It's okay. Delegate Higgins, Delegate Kent, Senator Perry, Mr. Gill.
This is Senator Perry. I don't have.
Okay. Looks like none online. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. We do appreciate it, and their contact information is available, so if there's any follow-up questions from any member, please feel free to reach out. With that being said, we're going to move on to the PFAS policy considerations offered by the technical committee. Mr. James?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say right up front, Bailey, Davis, and Max Wheeler, thank you very, very much. You guys started the technical committee on a summer of exploration of PFAS. And I'll say it's been a learning experience. The committee has spent a great deal of time talking about what are some of the things that you should be thinking about relative to what you just listened to. And some of you asked some of the very questions that I'm going to mention here. But let me real quickly run through this because we've got our folks from Digital Realty online to talk about data centers, our other second most favorite topic. This is meant to be some background information on PFAS and to identify some policy implications or consideration affecting you as local and state policymakers. I'm not going to say those words that Max can pronounce. I cannot. PFAS come from many sources, as you heard. Firefighting foam is one that's most well known, as well as Teflon, waterproofing, dental floss, biosolids, and Brian, you brought it up, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit. There's widespread scientific agreement that PFAS can have many different adverse health impacts. You have a hard copy. I can send you the electronic. There's a link. In some of these, you'll see the hot links that takes you to the background information that we're referring to. EPA established the MCLs. You heard about that from Max. About the same time as when the MCL rule was finalized, EPA also issued a final rule designating PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, and that facilitates cost recovery Superfund. Examples exist where levels of PFAS in effluent from wastewater treatment facilities, food, other points of exposures exceed standards or safe limits. And we're just saying that's factually proven. On January 14, 2025, EPA issued the peer-reviewed draft risk assessment you heard mentioned earlier for PFOA and PFOAS in sewage sludge. Which examines the risk to humans from biosolids that contain those elements. While the initial comment period was set for March, then extended to August, the comment period has now closed, and the closure date was September 17th. Bryant referred to it in his talk. And you'll see there's a link there. You want the electronic copy, let me know. We will have it posted on the website once we get all our materials posted. All right, let's talk a little bit about compliance. Under what is CERCLA? We hear that term, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, and that is Superfund. Under that, parties that release hazardous waste or substances and there is a release to the environment are liable for damages associated with the release. It relates to a lot of the conversations we just had around the table. PFAS have been designated hazardous waste, and EPA has placed their priority on addressing PFAS from parties that have manufactured it, used it in the manufacturing process, federal facilities, and other industrial parties. In their guidance, EPA has placed a lower priority on community water system operators, publicly owned treatment works, publicly owned operated municipal solid waste landfills, publicly owned airports, local fire departments, and farms where biosolids are applied to land. Now that may give you a little relief, maybe not. The guidance highlights the fact that the agency has discretion so that while enforcement may not be pursued, every reasonable effort should be made to avoid the release of PFAS into the environment because the contamination can pose risk to health and environment. Moreover, future decisions, including litigation, could require enforcement even though those priorities have been seen as a lower priority by EPA. Although legislative action in the Commonwealth has been effective, and you heard a good summary of what's going on in the last 5 to 6 years, in starting us down the road to dealing with these challenges, there is clearly a need to keep advancing Virginia policy and actions. We need more details on PFAS sources and threats and management options. You heard them talk about the voluntary reporting that's going on. That's moving in the right direction. But the technical committee feels that we need to be rigorous in undertaking inventory of sources throughout the state. It is self-reporting. You heard the mention about WD-40, and I take that very seriously. And know this is not a criticism at all, because we're moving one step at a time to get the job done, but the job is massive. For biosolids that are placed on land, require disclosure of, and this is technical committee recommendation, require the disclosure of PFAS constituents, levels, and whether levels would exceed any federal or Virginia standard / acceptable risk. EPA has issued a final rule promulgating MCLs for 5 PFAS compounds and has indicated their plans to eliminate 3 of these PFAS MCLs from the rule, but retain the 2 widely recognized chemicals. And frankly, those 2 capture the vast majority. Okay, so you're going to capture those other ones by focusing on those 2 big ones in the vast majority of the cases. The Virginia Farm Bureau Federation has pointed out to us there is ongoing research, including in Virginia, that intends to increase our knowledge of potential impacts. Studies are ongoing to determine the impact of repeated applications of biosolids with low-level PFAS contamination. There are 2 particular studies that are going on that involve Virginia and Virginia Tech in the national research. One in Eastern Virginia and associated with the AREC there, and a second one in the western part of the state. Land, now let's talk about biosolids for just a second. Land application of biosolids solves 2 problems. First, the land application of biosolids provides a cheap method of disposal. Unfortunately, if land application of biosolids is banned, there is not sufficient capacity with incinerators and landfill space to accommodate biosolid disposal. There are only 3 things you can do with biosolids. You either land apply it, you incinerate it, or you bury it in a landfill. There are no other disposal options. Second, biosolids provide an inexpensive way to fertilize crops. However, the land application of biosolids with PFAS poses a threat to crops grown, grazing livestock, and their products, as well as surface and groundwater. Eliminating land application of biosolids as a primary method of disposal would likely soon exceed disposal capacities in landfills, as it has done in Maine. They banned it in Maine, and they are quickly running out of landfill space. We understand that increasing capacity for either landfilling or incineration would be a slow process. Think about that in a local approval process. Once biosolids with PFAS contaminate a farm or forest so that the property is no longer usable for its intended use, there is no feasible technology to remove PFAS contamination. It doesn't mean we won't someday have it. It doesn't exist today. In the absence of methods to destroy PFAS and biosolids on properties to which they have already been applied, should further application be suspended? We don't have an answer for you for that. A statewide strategy should be developed to address PFAS risks that have not otherwise been addressed. The point of what the technical committee has spent the summer talking about is these are not pleasant choices and there isn't a lot of wiggle room, but you need to be aware of what they are, and you've got it coming fast down the train here in Orange County, down the track. And with that, I'll stop. We wanted to put these out there. We felt it was important. And if you've got other things you want the technical committee to ponder as we continue to move forward on PFAS, I've got an agenda item at the end where we're asking you that question. I don't envy your public hearing. I mean, what you see right here is.
It's not mine, it's DEQ's public hearing on the permit, so.
Yeah, somebody at some point is going to turn and look at you. You're the supervisor, what are you going to do about it?
For everybody's, I had no knowledge of this document, so what I brought up earlier, I appreciate you putting this together, that it was coming on. And I guess, one quick question for you. So on I'm not interested in banning biosolids, because I agree, they're really good. I'm interested in not having PFAS at unacceptable levels in biosolids that hurt our dairy farms, our regular farms, and run off into our groundwater and into our river, which, as you know, in Orange County, the Rappahannock in particular, lots of farms that run into that watershed. And so that's what I'm concerned about when we have a utility, Rappahannock Service Authority, that has literally, it's one of those small ones, and they don't have the capacity barely to do their job as it is. So we've got to have massive change on this. This isn't, Orange County's not the only one that's facing this. It's across the Commonwealth.
And I guess the only answer I have for you is the logical next step is, technical committee feels it's important that we test the biosolids so we know. So a farmer could say, well, wait a minute, I want to go to a different source. Now, are there all sorts of implications to that? Absolutely. But,
and I don't know where the biosolids are coming from. Are they coming from some other state where is the control?
I doubt Maine could afford to send them all the way down here.
Well, it may not be Maine, but it could be our neighboring states, and there could be issues there as well.
So maybe what we can do is, I know Spotsylvania's got a really robust site where they take biosolids and mix it with yard waste and do a nice compost that's available. Maybe we can get somebody from there at the next meeting to kind of talk about some of the different methods that can be utilized in addition to the.
What about those ongoing studies at Virginia Tech? Can we get briefed on those? That sounds really important.
Yeah.
There's really prominent science in this field, and we don't know what we don't know.
But let's go with questions here. And so it looks like I have a question over here.
Yes. On the sludge. I mean, it's important. Caroline's agricultural area. It is important, but I don't understand. I would not want to drink water coming out of my tap. They pulled it right out of the river. They put it in my pipes. They know what's in it. They have to treat it. Why can't the state think of putting controls on the people who produce sludge? That if they're selling it, it needs to have to break down what's in it, and it has to be approved by the state. Why are they not controlled?
So, well, there isn't one, so it's not like, why is it not? Don't know, but maybe one thing that we legislators could do is we could submit legislation for, this is just the way it goes, because if we try to do any regulation, they're going to be like, okay, what's the reason for this? We could do a work study where we get a group together to kind of look at what some other states are doing as far as regulating those things, make recommendations for Virginia to put some guardrails in place to kind of control those things. I know that Delegate Cole, Milday, myself, no others in the room here. Oh yeah, Weber. Yeah, he's normally not here, so. But, and then some of the senators as well, we can put our heads together and see what we can put forward as far as a work study bill to kind of find out what those parameters are. And so that's something that I've already got.
That's a logical place to start.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like point 5, a statewide strategy should be developed. And so the first starting point is that work study bill, kind of figure out what's the right direction go as far as legislation. Is it something that needs to be other agencies brought in, what agencies need to be worked with, and so that would be the starting point.
Mr. Chairman, in response to that really is kind of what we're saying. That's a next step. There are work groups at work now. Some of the folks on those work groups are in that audience up there on that screen. I recognize their names. The Chesapeake Bay Commission has a working group that they are in the process of pulling together, and the Virginia office of the Bay Commission, and we'll be hearing more about that. Also, the Southern Environmental Law Center contacted me this morning. They have just done a study and report and offered it to us. So we'll look at the Virginia Tech related studies. I think one of those is actually headquartered at Purdue. The Tech is involved in it.
So there are essentially no regulations on what's in biosolids at this point?
Not in Virginia.
Yeah, not in Virginia, no.
So there's other things like drugs and other things that go on.
No, some of those get tested.
Yeah, okay.
What's that?
Some of those, so there's a certain amount of testing that does go on, but it's not down to the PFAS level.
I mean, there's not a specific PFAS requirement related to
Other
testing.
things, there's testing.
Maryland does have regulations on that, and that is a learning point right now, is looking at what they're doing.
So if I can interject too, there's multi-levels of this when it comes to the PFAS. So you've got like biosolids and things like that, where you're going to have to test those sources where that compound, the biosolids are coming from, if you're going to take that route. And then also when it comes to the wells, Ike brought up earlier, we've had legislation to help out the rural localities be able to test and do that, but unfortunately that legislation has been defeated twice. And so hopefully, because that stuff costs money for an extra fund, so we can't all be provided by the federal government. So you're gonna have to look at that too. So that's you want to make sure everybody gets their well tested and make sure they're drinking safe water, but then also your point sources like Paul of this bill that dealt with the aquaquan is why we now have a lot more stuff dealing with the aquaquan. So we can get to those sources, get them tested, and then figure out what to do with those sources if they have higher level contaminants.
So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of put a pin in this for this moment in time, and we will circle back with identifying potential future agenda items. We come back to this and see what we want for future meetings, because we do have folks online that have been waiting patiently with their presentation on data center water demands and management. We have Ryan Young, Vice President, Americas Operations, and Yuri Lee, Director of Energy and Engineering, Americas Operations, Digital Realty. So.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Thank you for your patience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I share my screen, or you have something to look at?
You can share your screen, yep.
Let me share my screen because based on what I'm listening, I think that this screen, this presentation may help a little bit better for our discussion. So not knowing, the agenda here, we put the slide together. The first few slides is to give everyone an idea what data center is and what is the current trend in our industry, as well as the water and energy solution, the sustainability solution that maybe you are most interested. And I see that our director, managing principal Steve Smith is calling in. So Steve, maybe you want to start the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Yuri, and thanks everyone for having us on. And we know you have a busy agenda today, but thought it might be valuable when talking to Eldon about some of the interests and concerns of the committee here to give you some information. So we'll give you the deck. I think you may already have it already to help read through. It covers a lot of ground as far as the evolution of data centers and kind of the demands that have been put on data centers and the overall evolution of what we've been presented with as far as our industry is concerned, but also how we've addressed some of those challenges in trying to be more efficient and meet the demands of today. So I'm going to let Yuri take most of the conversation. I'm talking with Eldon, and I know Yuri's been sitting in listening to the conversation here. I know there's a lot of concern around water. And what we might do is just kind of glaze over the first few slides here in order to get to what I think you really care about, which is water and what we're doing to try to support you and the industry, what the industry is doing to try to be more conscientious, but still meet the demands of artificial intelligence and the data center industry as a whole. And I guess more of an education, but also a Q&A process here. But let me stop there real quick. And Eldon or anybody else in the room, does that make sense? Is there any other direction you'd like us to go?
If I may just interject for a quick logistical item, Steve, we're, and Yuri, we're seeing the presentation or build out mode. If you wouldn't mind expanding the screen or switching the monitor.
There you go.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, speak up just a tad. We've maxed our volume out in this room. We're in a
okay.
echoey room.
Fair enough. We'll try to speak loudly.
Thank you.
Anything else as far as direction on content? I want to make sure this is valuable for you. I personally have a hard stop in about 20 minutes. Yuri, I'm not sure what your schedule looks like. We're happy. This is not necessarily a one and done conversation. We're happy to answer questions now, after the fact, come back, answer questions. At the end of the day, we're all trying to solve the problem responsibly and meet the demands of the industry. So again, this is
I think if you'll jump and really start focusing in on your slides on water and power, because they're so closely related.
Yeah, in fact, why don't you go back just one slide real quick, Yuri, to right there. That'd be great. Just to kind of give you, I guess, a setup to where we're going as far as water is concerned. For those of you that don't know the history of data centers and where we've been, I'm going to go quickly here, but data centers have been around for a long time. But what have happened with data centers, both in terms of the requirements, which comes in the form of density. So when you think of density, think about how many kilowatts of power are being absorbed in a cabinet of servers or communication gear in a data center. And the density or the amount of power that's being consumed in each of those racks has increased dramatically over the years. And it's not for every application. Many enterprise customers are still using, let's call it 5 to 10 kilowatts per rack. But when you talk about the advent of artificial intelligence and densities that go with those type of racks, they're much taller, they're much heavier, and they use a lot more power, upwards of, actually it says 150 kilowatts plus. We're seeing 400 kilowatts, even upwards of a megawatt per cabinet in some cases. So that puts, when you consume that much power, that generates more heat. And when you generate more heat, that requires more cooling in order to make sure that those servers continue to operate as they were designed. So that cooling can and oftentimes involves water. So how that water is used is where I'm going to let Yuri, he's the expert on this, kind of get into what that looks like. But more than anything, I just wanted to kind of set up the conversation and know that the demands have increased significantly while we have gotten more efficiently addressing those demands over time through different technologies. And some of that technology is continuing to evolve even as we speak. So Yuri, I'll kind of turn it over to you from here.
Sure. Thank you.
You can help guide through a little bit more of the detail.
Okay. There's a lot of feedback, and if we can mute that, that'd be great. I hope that you hear me okay. One thing that I want to use the slide to show the difference between digital and many other data center. There's actually two different kind of data center. One is a hyperscaler like Google, Matter. They do build up a gigantic data center. They do use a lot of energy, but Digital Realty or some other similar company, although we're a data center company, but we actually cultivate for a co-location, which is more for a small to mid-sized firm. So we are helping the local business to have their data center. As Steve mentioned that in the past, many of the office, you will see a network room, a computer room back in the office area. Now they're just basically consolidating into our data center and we make it a lot more efficient. So I want to make that one definition. And then as Steve mentioned, yes, we use a lot of energy, and this is generally a highlight of how data center work. There's a lot of server setup, and we basically contain the hot air coming out from the server, and this hot air going to the equipment, and we cool it down, and we have a different means to cool down the hot air using air or water. And the reason why some of our facility use water, because water in general is just more efficient than using air. This is some of the properties of the air and water, the comparison between the two. And because water is more density, the higher density with carrying more heat and is transferring heat faster. In general, as a whole, between the system or between the two particular identical data center, if one using air, the other one using water, water is generally used 10 to 30 less energy as a whole for cooling the same amount of IT load. So that's why some of the older data center is using water. Nowadays in the industry, we are using a lot more air just because we don't want to deal with the water or we have water limitation at different site. However, the one thing that I wanted to point to you, this is a slide that I just adding to this presentation that you don't have, is to bring to your attention the energy and water nexus. This is representing how the power being generated by different power grid. And on the right-hand side, there's a map for the North America, how the power is being generated. For Virginia, we still have a decent percentage of the power generated by nuclear as well as a gas turbine. So all these nuclear is actually using a lot of water to generate the power. And you can see gas will be lower, and the hydropower and solar power, those are the renewable energy, and they don't require water to cool down the central plant. So that is actually the most sustainable power source, and we made note of that, and we are actually actively sourcing our power through the hydro and solar sources. And there's also for the power grid, there's also power loss, and that's why there's a corresponding loss. Basically, this is like considered as a water efficiency of generating the power. So at the community level, regulation level, I mean, I will encourage you not only looking at the building level, which is where I'm living, but also need to look at holistically how everyone is drawing the power because it does consume a lot of water as well. So I oversee the energy and water program for Digital Realty. And so basically my main responsibility is to find energy opportunity and water saving opportunity. As I mentioned from the last slide, we source heavily to find renewable solar energy and hydro energy. We also try to offset the load. We have engineering solution to cool the hot air in the wintertime more effectively. We call it a free cooling. And so if we can store those heat in the summertime and offload into the summer, we will do something like that. And we'll also use the engine because every site we have a emergency generator. We will use those engine to help answering some of the demand, the high demand time in the peak summertime. It's and then we also utilize an engineering solution to capture the waste heat. We'll send it to the adjacent neighbor if they can utilize this waste heat, such as laundry, greenhouse, swimming pool, some of those ideas to basically we utilize the waste heat. From the energy reduction standpoint, they goes hand in hand. The less energy we use, the less water we need to consume and use the water to cool down the plant. So we have different technique. These are just some of the high level example that I involve trying to execute within our data center portfolio. And I can always go back if there's a specific question. But then the next slide, maybe you have the most interest in the water. So in particular for the water, we utilize district reclaimed water wherever it is available. In Ashburn, there is an infrastructure that provide us the district reclaim, or sometimes people call it industrial water. And we will tap into those and utilize those to make up a cooling tower as much as we can. And we have done, I think that we have 12 buildings through our North America portfolio that using district reclaimed water. We will collect any of the rainwater and evaporation water that we can to reuse them. And we're also trying to partner with the water stewardship projects to basically fund and finance the project so that we recharge our underground reservoir, as an example, to provide positive water back into the community. And from the water reduction standpoint, the main technique for me is to basically provide manual water audit. And based on a few audit that we have done, we also now utilizing the AI and basically create reinforcement learning to understand if there's anomaly water use, because that means that we may have some leakage in our system, or the valve may not close 100%. Things are not as easy for us to detect. We do use AI to compare these historic water use so that provide us early warning so that we can look into the issues. Now I'm also deploying resolution water submeter, and basically instead of just relying on utility meter that just report water consumption monthly, I'm deploying additional submeter in our plan, and it provide minute by minute water consumption and upload to the cloud. So I can utilize that so that I can notify any in regulation water consumption at our plan. And water treatment system. So in our cooling tower, when we use water to reject heat, we use a cooling tower. Cooling tower require water treatment, and we have an active water treatment to all the plant using water. And there's a newer technology that we can deploy so that we can enhance the water treatment, so that we can keep the water and recycling the water more than what it used to be. And there's also technique that we utilize the blow down water. We recover it and go through some RO system and send it back to the cooling tower so that we reduce the blow down and discharge from our site back to the sewage system. We now also looking at the irrigation water. I mean, everything is like, as long as we use water, is my responsibility to reduce. So irrigation water benchmark tracking is basically map out our landscape, and based on the weather, and then the landscape type, we calculate and project the benchmark or water that we're supposed to use. And based on that, we can flag if there's any anomaly or overuse of water. And then we go back to look at maybe there's a leakage in the irrigation line, things like that. And then the next step to go after that is to deploy smart irrigation. So then this is, instead of just a time-based controller, it will be based on the actual soil moisture and then the forecast, weather forecast. If we are anticipate there's an upcoming rainstorm, then we are not going to over water the plant and just let the rain to take care of. So that's, I don't know how much time I have, so this is a really quick slide. There's two more slides. So this is showing you the evolution of a data center. I would say that in general, data center industry, the competitor, we are benchmarking ourselves. We are competing with our competitor to make sure that we find the most energy and water efficient technique. So this is the evolution of data center cooling that show maybe the last 30 years. From the left to right, as you can see, there's many different mechanical technique or engineering to address the heat rejection. And you can see that right now we are basically using the evaporative or liquid cooling on the far right side. They are already looking at the low POE and low WUE. And POE and WUE is a metric that the data center industry share. It is a metric to measure the efficiency, how we utilize the water or power effectively. So this is the explanation. And on the right-hand side, it's showing to you that this is a Northern America for digital realty. That the last 2 years since I took over this water program, we have seen continuous monthly trailing. Each point of this is a trailing 12-month, and so we is continue seeing reduction of water consumption or increase of water efficiency. And right now, all the new facility that we are building, we are not using the water. We in our North America portfolio, we currently have roughly 25% of our data center still using water. Remaining of the facility using air cool, and there's mainly air cool. And we do, as a company, we are aiming to 2032 to have a water neutrality, meaning that we'll help to reclaim, recharge the aquifer and different projects to replenish the water sources. And so
Thanks, Yuri.
that's a quick slide. I have a few more after this to support any of the questions, but in the interest of time, that's all I have right now.
Good question. Is the water leaving the site in gas form, liquid form, or if it's both, what's roughly the percentage in some of these scenarios? I'm looking at what we're doing right now, the current technology that's being built.
So why don't you go back 2 slides there, Yuri, if you would? There you go, right there. Because I think the answer is, and Yuri, I'll let you kind of fill in the gaps here, but the answer is it depends. Because we have this mix of different cooling techniques, depending upon the type of customer and also the legacy of the data center. So older data centers, when water really was not that big of an issue, and customers were not consuming that much power, so the cooling really wasn't that big of a concern. They would have these cooling towers, as Yuri mentioned, that would basically, run water through these chiller towers, evaporate the water out of it, that would basically cool down the air, and then pump that air through, in various forms. And he mentioned other ways that we've gotten more efficient about that. That still happens, and there's some combinations of how that happens and how often it happens, but even that technique has gotten much more efficient over the years in that, for example, at night when we don't need to run as much water through it, or in the winter, we can go to strictly air chillers, as Yuri mentioned, more of a hybrid type of approach. We're also reclaiming water that would otherwise just drop to the ground or run off the roof, and we're recycling that water and adding ways that we can reuse that water. So that's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum that I think, as Eldon and I were talking, that might be of interest to this team is the direct-to-chip, when you see that on the far right side. That still uses water, but the way it uses water is not in an evaporative form, really through a closed-loop system that basically takes water off of a closed-loop water pipe and then runs that through chillers, and then it then works together with what we call a CDU that in many cases will cool down glycol or other coolant that will then run piping directly through the server to the chips. You might hear about NVIDIA chips and those kind of things that need, they put off more heat and need cooling directly at the chip. That piping will run liquid right through the server, right next to the chip, absorb that heat, and then run it back through essentially a heat exchanger that then is cooled off by the closed loop water. So it kind of depends on where you are in that spectrum. And
okay, I want to try to make this a quick, Mr. Chair, a quick answer if you can. So on the far right, liquid alternate, how are you losing water?
We are not even consume water at that point. It's more for the general office use, like the people use a bathroom. That's pretty much it. We are not even use water on the right side of the spectrum.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other quick questions?
Just have one, and this may be stupid, but based on our previous conversation, does any of this water that's been circulating through pipes and everything else actually get into our groundwater?
No, No, if we are using the older technology like the far left, then we use a cooling tower. So there is still some blow down that coming out from the system. It will go into the sewage.
Real quick.
And Dr. Young?
Chairman, my question was in reference to when you mentioned about the rainwater. So does that impact or obscure the fact that individuals that have well are people that are collecting rainwater, if you're taking that rainwater before they get it, is that an issue for these homeowners or individuals?
So if we utilize rainwater collection system, we will go through a tertiary water treatment to filter the water. We also have a way to call a first flush, so it will just dump the dirt, and then we go through the tertiary treatment so that it will make up the cooling tower. So it's the roof that we collect, so it should not really affect any residential or even adjacent neighbor.
Does that
Okay,
answer the
thank you.
question? Okay. Any other questions?
Really answered it, but
Yeah, I think you were more looking for if the rain's coming down and data center's taking the water, what's left for the homeowner that's on a private well where they're relying on that same rainwater for consumption. So how does that factor into this? The rainwater that's now being consumed by the data center and not available for consumption by the resident.
I mean, all of that has to be factored into, the full scheme of how much water is available in the area, right? So in many cases, we'll work directly with the local municipality to make sure that we understand what those dynamics are. In many cases, as Yuri pointed out, there is no impact because much of that is more surface water that would otherwise be evaporative or not consumed by, any long-term, resident or well system. But there's ways that we can work with the local municipality to make sure that that's the case. And in some cases, if it is, then we work for various offsets and how to make sure that we're all coordinated, right? I mean, I think, as I mentioned, that's the main thing, is that everybody is transparent, I think, about what is being used and what isn't, and trying to get as efficient as possible.
Also, keep in mind that if we are building any data center, and I think in general in the industry, they will be on the right side of the spectrum. So we don't even need water to begin with, so we would not have a rain collection system for that type of design.
Excellent.
I hope that.
Make a comment or?
Yes, Mr. Billups.
In regard, I read a recent study that despite all we're doing to improve tree cover in the Commonwealth, that tree cover continues to decline. Tree cover is a primary thing that filters water and relies water quality in the Rappahannock River. So how are data centers impacting tree cover in Virginia, and what are they doing to mitigate their impact on tree cover?
I think that we are looking for opportunity to partner with the community, right? This will be fall under the partnership. The last slide. Partnership of water stewardship projects. We are trying to see what we can do as a company to help in this situation, because that we don't have that much trees, so we can't really help and have a direct impact, but we can help contribute into the community for that type of projects.
Any other questions? All right, thank you all very much for the presentation. Mr. James?
Yeah, Steve and Yuri, thank you very, very much. This kind of gets us started into some of the emerging technologies. And as we go forward, if we've got other questions, I will direct them your way.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alden. And as you probably know, we have a campus in Manassas there that is right off of 10051 Brickyard Way, where we would be happy to do a tour if you guys would like to do a tour. It's still being developed, but it's also being developed with the most current technology that Yuri mentioned earlier. So if that would be helpful, sometimes I think it's helpful just to kind of see it in action so you can understand the scope and scale and how the technology works. So if that'd be valuable, we'd be happy to host the team at some point in the future.
Yeah, we'll put out a communication and see if there's any interest from the members, and we'll follow up with you on that. Thank you very much for that invitation.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for having us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, moving on to the next order of business, work group updates. And I think a couple of the work group coordinators saw that coming up and they said, we're gonna take a leave. So first up, we have Delegate Milday with the state incentives for data centers.
Want to stay under Sid?
However you prefer, if you want to go up to the podium, or if you want to sit here, your call.
It's actually, it's relatively simple. There's not a whole lot of incentives actually for data centers, but there certainly is a big, you want me to go?
No, the camera's out again, so just keep going.
There certainly is a big VDEP, I'm saying that right.
You got it.
I always get it mixed up. Offers a big sales tax exemption for data centers, purchasing of anything that has to do with the data center, from building it to the stuff that goes inside of it. And they are pretty much mandated agreements, and this is for Amazon only, across the Commonwealth and planning districts. I know about ours, that I'm in, Planning District 16, got together and agreed to, the individual counties and localities agreed to an arrangement by which they would give back a large portion of the tax collected on real estate and business property to satisfy what is a matching requirement for their VDEP. So, in other words, they said they definitely get a big break on their sales tax. And then the counties, I'll give you, I like using the example in Stafford of a new data center campus that's being built. It's going to generate about 100, it's called the Stafford Technology Campus. If it's occupied, if it's leased by Amazon, it will qualify. It will generate $100 million a year in tax revenue. And you hear a lot of stuff about them getting tax breaks, and here's the truth on this particular project. They are capped off at 10% of their infrastructure costs for Stafford. Amazon is. So they will probably occupy that campus, and they will get up to $39.2 million back of their property tax that they're paying and real estate tax, which will be less than a year's worth of tax. And that will satisfy the matching portion of the saved sales tax. That's mandated on the counties. I'm assuming that in other planning districts, there's something similar to that with Amazon. After the first 10 years, there's another part that kicks in. If they had a $15 billion capital improvements, they can have up to 20% of their local tax revenue given back to them. Besides that, there are another tool that Stafford put in place years ago because they wanted data centers years ago was technology zones, and those are enabling legislation at the state level, lets the counties forgive certain types of taxes, I think merchants capital and business property, but those are negotiated on a case-by-case basis. They're not automatic. You can't force the data center, data centers can't force the localities to give them that deal, but you certainly could sit down with them if you're trying to attract them and give them, you're enabled to give them a break on on some of those taxes. And as far as I can tell, and as far as my commissioner of our commissioner of revenue can tell him, those are the incentives that are available.
Any questions for Delegate? All right,
Just curious, I'm surprised to hear that the counties are participating in those incentives. Are other counties doing that? We're not.
In which ones?
Any county-based incentive.
No, where Stafford County hasn't given one to anyone since 2019, and it was not a data center. We can also use them for pharmaceutical.
The 39 million you're talking giving back.
Yeah, my understanding is that is, you don't have at least in Stafford and Planning District 16, that is, you don't have a choice. They can Amazon can avail themselves of that agreement that they made with the state.
But it's specific to those counties.
Yes, yeah. But I would just imagine we were not the only one. I just don't know I didn't research the entire state.
Anybody
Yes,
that's
Mr.
not Northern Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, Culpeper County has a tax incentive, a portion of our technology campus. And having said that, I'll introduce here is our Director of Economic Development, Brian Rothman. He's going to lead us on our data center tour today. Brian, would you like to expand a little bit on our tax incentive program?
The county enabled technology center in Culpeper County. So the facilities inside the technology center, which you can tour later, is 40% of all taxes paid for 5 years, based off of the investment. If they invest $10 million and hire 10 employees at the prevailing average wage, really that helps us enable our tax rate's higher than some other counties that have already been mentioned. It enables us to get below that, but only on the initial investment, not on those refreshes. So we still anticipate by calendar year 2030, post-incentive, so money that county will keep of $100 million, calendar year 2031, $162 million off of the tax side.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Marshall.
Just for clarification, it's not just Plan District 16, that incentive package that was given down from EDP, and the localities had to match that was for Amazon, which was called Project Holiday. Spotsylvania, Stafford, City of Fredericksburg, and Caroline all affected by it.
Okay.
Yeah, King George
It's part of Plan District.
was in it, but not, y'all didn't have Amazon.
That is still up to negotiation.
All right, thank you, Delegate Milday. The next one was Delegate Cole, talking about the most endangered river rating number 6 on the list. And since he's not here, we're going to move on. The next work group was to look at the growth and capacity of the river, and that was Councilmember Holmes, who is also left. And so that leaves us with the number, the last, thank you for still being here, work group, and that is surface water intake permits. Supervisor Binder, do we have anything on that?
I didn't prepare anything
Okay.
because I wasn't exactly sure what to give, but one of the big things that we came up at GWRC, we talked about this a lot on Monday, and one of the biggest things is we do not have accurate data about how much capacity the whole Rappahannock River has. So these surface water intake permits, there are farm ones that are unregulated because they're grandfathered in, and DEQ doesn't even know, and if DEQ is still in the room, can verify that we don't have an accurate account of even those permits. You have, each locality might have an intake. You have one very large, we've already mentioned the name, AWS, who owns an intake, and that they inherited from Birchwood when they purchased the property. So we don't really have an accurate data set to tell us how much capacity is in the river. Would I be fair, Brent, on that one?
That would be fair to say.
And maybe at the legislature level is some study group that basically could get that information, because it's hard to tell for those permits, or when you make these deals with people that potentially could take water, industrial users, whatever it is, from the river. How do you know what the capacity is to make educated? So I would recommend, and any feedback from those in the room, a comprehensive study is how much capacity is in the river and how much is it being affected by salinity and all those other things.
If you could, for the next meeting, have some sort of summary of what you would like included in that study.
I could do that.
That way, if any one of us who's going to Richmond next year, we can take that and draft legislation for a study to be done on that.
So you think that might be a good, I thought it would be good, and we said that at GWRC, that would be a really good thing to
I'm
have.
not saying one thing or another, but if we have something that the committee can then take action on and say, yes, as a committee, we support this idea, and we want to push this to Richmond, then as a commission, we can say, this is something that we support.
Okay, I can do that.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Yeah, we'll go with Delegate Kent online, and then we'll come to Dr. Young.
Okay, no problem.
Yep, Delegate Kent.
Just to piggyback off of that a little bit, I did have legislation in last session, and it was regarding surface water intakes on the river. To kind of speak to your point, Supervisor Binder. So we are working on that in one capacity. It was more for aquafauna, but it does look at the salinity levels of the river and takes all of that into account. And so we pushed for that for appropriation. So my bill didn't pass, but it got put through in appropriations in the budget. So there is an element of kind of what you're speaking to that we are working on legislatively.
So I think
what
I think I just heard is Delegate Kent agreed to be your legislative champion for this.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you so much, Delegate Scott, for your quick diplomacy on that.
Mr. James, I promised Dr. Young the floor next.
Yeah, no, my question is just that if you need someone to champion the other studies, if it doesn't come through, I'll be happy to take up one for the committee.
Okay.
Delegate Kent, this is Eldon. The legislation you were referring to and was handled in the budget, is that the money that was appropriated to VIMS for doing the capacity study?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, the next thing on the agenda is future meeting dates, locations. That's there on the agenda. December 3rd, Meadow Event Park, March 25th, 2026, my home county. June 17th, Richmond County, and then September 30th of next year, Madison County. And so look forward to being with you all again in December. And then identifying potential future agenda items. We already had a few things. We have Data Center Coalition, PFAS. Mr. James, what were some of the notes that we took from the conversation?
Well, on PFAS, more information from Spotsylvania County on what they're doing relative to composting and biosolids, and I'll be talking with Kevin about that. Ongoing studies and reports, so the research of Virginia Tech's involved in the two studies, bring some more information back to the commission on that. Make available the Southern Environmental Law Center study, and I did communicate with them. They are happy to brief the technical committee at one of our next two meetings, which would be before the commission meeting. So we may be able to cull some information from that. And we'll be looking at Delegate Kent's legislation from last year, and then a question of what other data center-ish information would this commission like us to pull forward?
I would like us to
Mr. Millis.
pursue the tree cover issue that data centers impact. Amount of tree cover impact, because that directly impacts the water quality of the river.
I think we've had presentations on that in the past.
I'll have to look at that.
We did a lot of presentations on the healthy forest, which gave us the data on how valuable forests were to water quality.
But nothing as specific as what you're talking about.
But I've read that we've been doing a lot in Virginia for tree cover, but the tree cover is still declining, and I don't know, it didn't specifically say, but I suspect that data center and solar development may have an impact on that directly.
Well, development in general.
Yeah, development in general, yeah.
And that was some of the conversations from before when we were working with Healthy Watershed Forest, and I'll reach out to Terry Lasher because he was involved in bringing some of that information to us. Okay.
And then, so we're going to have a legislative recommendation. If you could have some conversations with Delegate Kent in the meantime to see what she tried to do, what we can build on that. Delegate Milday, if you could have any potential legislation for us to consider as a commission, a recommendation to send to the General Assembly, to send to the electeds at the state level, that would be great. Or if there's not much that you think that we can do.
As far as incentives.
As far as rolling back, I'd be more than happy to sponsor such legislation. Rolling back incentives, that way the counties don't feel like their hands are tied as much. Or if you feel there's nothing necessarily there that can be done, but any recommendations that you feel that the work group can say, hey, we suggest this, and then I'll follow up with the other two folks.
Safety controls on sludge.
Yep.
And thank you. I left that off the list. Not only what we talked about here, but what's going on with some of the other work groups that are trying to develop consensus legislation that would be the next step. And of course, I think if the commission agrees with the technical committee, one of our next steps would be, we want to know what's in the bios so that the farmer has that information before they say, yes, apply it, or no, don't.
So I think one of the next steps with some of those work groups that are already out there is a lot of that stuff kind of comes to culmination towards the end of the year, and then it gets disseminated. And a lot of times it's not done in time for any legislation next year, but it can be something that we definitely look at for the March 25th meeting and really prepare for the next year. And I know it's not the best way that we want to do things, like we want to get it taken care of now, we want to address it now. But the nature of these studies is you have all these different, and that's why we did some of our own work groups here, because instead of relying on an outside source to give us information that's going to come in November, and then by the time we disseminate it to the commission, then now December's come and gone, and there's no opportunity for any legislative action. But by taking the data center issue, the water issue, and some of these other things, looking at it within the commission here, we kind of did our own studies. and then we have our own recommendations that we're gonna be able to bring to the table, but there are some of these other groups that are doing some of these studies on the biosolids and the sludge and all this stuff, and when that information becomes available, then we can look at that and kind of come up with any legislative suggestions. And that's kind of the direction that we're trying to take this commission is, here's the issue, this is the data, this is the legislative recommendation. So with the tree cover, like, is there a legislative recommendation that this commission is gonna then send to the electeds that are on this commission, on this body, to take to Richmond? And so, a lot of good stuff. Yes?
I would just wanted to piggyback off of Jason's, because you might not know, the HB 206 got reconvened to look at forest cores. And so that might be to reach out to the folks in DEQ that are running that to get some information to put in there.
All right. Any other matters of question, comment?
Is there any way we could get any information on the carbon filtration technology vis-a-vis PFAS, keeping PFAS out of drinking water? I don't know what's out there. I don't know enough about it. I know
we'll follow up with DEQ and VDH and see what they have. If there's just information that we can just push out to the body, or if it's a presentation they can provide in the future. So that just might be a documentation they can provide to you.
I'm something I want to take up with the technical.
Okay. All right. Any other matters? Hearing none. Second, third, fourth, all in favor? Aye. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Let's